Welcome. I now have a very large microphone. Welcome to this marking of 5 years since the Victorian Royal Commission to Family Violence, a watershed for Australia and, dare I say, for the world in understanding, preventing and responding to family violence. My name is Sharon Pickering. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts at Monash University, and I wish you all the warmest of welcomes, both here in person and online. For those of us joining us via the live stream event, I'm sorry to have to relay to you that the pre-event chatter was high. In fact, it felt a little bit like an extended family reunion, and I think we are all still joyous in being able to come together. We do remember a time pre-COVID when coming to an event after work or battling the various parking or traffic was a burden, and now look at how we embrace it. It is wonderful to have you in the room, and it is wonderful to have you online. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and Aboriginal elders from other lands that may be here with us this evening, and of course to those joining us online. I especially want to acknowledge Indigenous women for their tenacious and enduring leadership, most especially in the field of family violence. It is before I introduce Dr. Carolyn Briggs to do a welcome to country, I would especially like to pay a special welcome to Emeritus Professor Anne Edwards, AO, Chair of the Monash Gender and Family Violence Prevention Centre Advisory Board. Our keynote this evening, Christine Nixon, AO. Associate Professor Kate Fitzgibbon, Director of the Monash Family Violence Centre. Professor Muriel Bamblett, AO, CEO of VACA. Aleri Butler, CEO of Family Safety Victoria, and our many colleagues from Family Safety Victoria here tonight. Assistant Commissioner Lauren Callaway from the Family Violence Command at Victoria Police, Tanya Faha, CEO of Domestic Violence Resource Centre and Domestic Violence Victoria, Tracy Gaudry, CEO of Respect Victoria, Jennifer Jackson, Chair of the Victims Survivors Advisory Council, and all the members of the Victim Survivors Advocacy Council, who I think took up a fair share of the chatter beforehand. Jackie Watt, CEO of Say No to Violence. To the many family violence sector practitioners, Monash colleagues, friends, a warm welcome, and a particularly warm welcome to Dr. Carolyn Briggs, AM, Bunurong Senior Elder and a great friend to Monash University. Thank you, Carolyn.
So, just running from one research paper to another one. I work in research and in a particular an area where we look at across Australia with Indigenous issues that are impacting on remote, regional and urban communities. So I went from one place to another and trying to find a car park. I should have one as an elder. And I think, you know, I'm privileged. I also work at Monash at the Caulfield campus in Wominjeka, Jambana. Just finished a whole process on tree stories. So you keep adapting and you keep challenging yourself in opportunities. And just met someone that when I was working at La Trobe Uni in Bendigo years ago. Beautiful to catch up with all these people. It's like a reunion in other ways. So, and also pay my respects to Christine because we were neighbours in North Melbourne. So this is a whole big journey cycle, and also I pay my respects to Muriel, who's been a long time. See, we're just making these discussions, so I'm just making sure I've got all my notes here. It's about understanding how we could come. So yes, so it's Wominjeka, Marambik Bik Bunurong, Namde Barupton Ata Willem. Come with a purpose to my beautiful home, the lands of the two great bays, Narram, Port Phillip Bay, and Marron, Western Port Bay. Can you all hear me? Forget these things are around us. It is about that challenge, because Wominjeka is about a challenge to you. It's about what do you bring, how do you come to this beautiful country we now know as Melbourne. And it is my duty here today to welcome you to country, more specifically to ask you that you come to my country with a purpose. The word, like I said, is not so much the meaning of welcome, but rather a directive for you to come with a purpose so that you can think about why you're here. That purpose is a really interesting thing. It is something that needs to be bigger than ourselves, and it also has to be something that is beneficial to our communities. To think about your present and how it relates to these things. According to the stories of Bunwurrung and the lands we meet of the Yalukit Willem, and to our neighbours, the Woiwurrung, and how Bunjil created our land that we're now part of and we're present to. Bunjil not only created the lands and of the Kulin people, he also created Wurrungi Bik, the law of the land. And this law of the land is about these responsibilities. Our laws of the land are our customary laws, much like our laws that we live today. These laws dictated how we interacted with each other, how we interacted with the land, and how we conduct ourselves when we're on somebody else's country. The Bunwurrung Wurrungi Bik speaks of 3 Pacific laws. The first law is knowledge, or yilinj. It is a responsibility that we have knowledge. And once knowledge is attained, we then have the responsibility to ensure its survival, its continuation. We have a responsibility to our younger generation to maintain that knowledge and pass it down to our future generations. And it's about those gatherings and thinking about what Wurrungi Bik and knowledge, and that knowledge that has been handed over the generations since time began, and how we stand together on this special country and reflect on the memories of the past and how we can move forward together. And like I said, it was a transmission of knowledge and understanding that ensured our culture survived. This commitment to learning has been a part of every generation since time began. And it's one of the reasons why we are still strong today. Dilbruk, showing respect. In our traditions, visitors are always welcome, but they're required to show their respect to the laws of the land, Wurrungi Bik. The same way, we share respect to each other's diversities, cultures, religious or spiritual beliefs today. And we are here to gather, and it's called Chanabi, a celebration. The celebration of life, the arrival of new children, that coming of the new seasons, the 6 seasons. The visiting neighbouring clans was very much an important part of our traditional life. And Melbourne not only represents one of those important places for the celebration of our contemporary Indigenous arts and culture, it also prides itself on celebrating our multicultural and global society. The next pillar is respecting sacred ground, or the Wurrungi Bik, or what we all shall acknowledge as Babanata, Mother of Earth, on which we stand. And Melbourne today is a host to many people from many different nations, and we still call upon them to Dilbruk, or respect Mother Earth, by understanding its history and heritage of the first peoples of the 5 language groups that make up our Eastern Kulin. And what we celebrate in this gathering today is to review the 5 years of this amazing outcome for this Monash Gender and Family Violence Prevention Centre. And it is that 5 years anniversary event that we're here. Maybe we can think about how we can keep scaffolding and building on that, because every time there's always a new thing that is impacting on us through violence, violence of people, violence of how we reacted. And I think the evidence was demonstrated after a year of, it came to the forefront after the nearly the whole year of being locked down. And how are we preparing ourselves for the future? This pandemic or these issues are never going to go away till we work out some sort of solution and how we put these into action. There's a brains trust out there, collectively. We can all scaffold that process to look at how we bring change and how do we bring up our children in this environment that has lots of challenges in this complex society that we now live in. And what these ongoing commitments to the spirit of the generosity that still remains an important part of the First Peoples of this Eastern Kulin culture. And today it is my hope that we can all take pride in our shared history and celebrate the strength of our great nations within this complex Australia, which we know now as Australia, this amazing continent. It's got Australia, but it's a recognising all those diversities within it. And according to our traditions, our lands will always be protected by our Creator, Bunjil, who travels as an eagle, and by Wan, who protects our waterways, travels as a crow. Bunjil taught us to always welcome guests, but he required us to ask all guests to make a number of commitments or dumbals, not to harm our big bigs, not to harm our warnies, our waterways, and particularly not harm our bububs, our children. And this commitment is made through an exchange of a small bow dipped in the water of the land. So once again, I can acknowledge and say in the words of my ancestors, the continuation of 80,000 years of human history. Wamanjika, Marambik Bunarong, Namda Baruptan Ata Willam. Welcome to my beautiful home, the lands of the two great bays, Nungujin.
Thank you, Carolyn, for such a warm welcome. We so appreciate your words that you share with us, and certainly coming with purpose. And it would be remiss of me not to recognise that it was the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody that showed us how much a Royal Commission can uncover, but how difficult it is to realise the intent and actuality of recommendations and the challenge to be able to transform as a result of such a significant political and legal and social intervention that is a Royal Commission. So here we are, marking the 5-year anniversary of the findings and recommendations of the Royal Commission into Family Violence that was led by the Honourable Marcia Neave, Emeritus Professor at Monash University. Marcia has recently been appointed Commissioner of the Royal Commission into Child Abuse in Tasmania. So unfortunately, she cannot be with us here tonight, but I want to recognise her many contributions, not only, of course, to the Royal Commission itself, but to the many efforts in promoting and implementing its recommendations. The Royal Commission, as you all know so well, called for the transformation of all aspects of Victoria's response to family violence and its prevention efforts. The 227 recommendations that were made by the Commission laid a world-leading roadmap for reform. Monash University is delighted to host this event to mark the significance of today's anniversary and, importantly, to provide a forum to hear from sector and government leaders on the achievements of the reforms and, importantly, what is still needed. The Monash Gender and Family Violence Prevention Centre have had the privilege to contribute to this reform work alongside our government and sector partners. I was struck this morning when I was in the car listening to the radio, hearing some female MPs speak out against the culture of toxic masculinity in our federal parliament. I was struck by their comments about remaining silent out of loyalty to the party, of the individual and collective impacts of enduring, witnessing, or having knowledge of the emotional, social, cultural and physical harms of male entitlement and gender-based violence that have become part of everyday life of surviving in that place. Of those harms being known and endured but unspoken, of being kept under wraps and indoors, inside the houses of our parliament, inside the family of party politics. It is clearer now than ever before that the many structures that undergird political participation have been fundamentally set against gender equality in much the same ways that the structures of society, and most particularly its central unit of the family, have for so long been set against gender equality. And that the violence we speak to and seek to eradicate is, of course, all about power. And so to dismantle that violence in the family or in the parliament, we need to dismantle the many ways that power operates in those places. And that, of course, requires systemic, procedural, attitudinal and behavioural changes. And it is not at all incremental. So tonight we have an opportunity to reflect on the Victorian Royal Commission into Family Violence, a courageous and critical intervention, and one that has sought to go to the heart of our society. And we do it in a very particular moment of social and political reckoning, a gender-based reckoning, where the individual and the collective demand for change is palpable. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our first speaker this evening. Christine Nixon AO is the former Chief Commissioner of Victoria Police, Monash Council and Monash College Board member. She is a Fellow of the Australian Institute of Police Management, the Australian Institute of Management and the Institute of Public Administration Australia. Christine sits on the Advisory Board for the Monash Gender and Family Violence Prevention Centre and has been an incredibly valued contributor to all areas of the Centre's work. Christine was the first female Chief Commissioner, and do remember there's only ever one Chief Commissioner, in any Australian state or territory, taking on the role in 2001 and holding the position for some 8 years. Christine has been a formidable leader and advocate in relation to family violence, and I most especially want to recognise her work in raising up women, supporting colleagues to achieve all kinds of change. Following Christine's address, I will hand over to the Director of our Centre, Kate Fitzgibbon, to facilitate the panel discussion. Please join me in welcoming Christine to the stage.
Thanks, Sharon, for that very kind introduction. It's lovely to see you, Dr. Briggs, and to all of the Aboriginal elder women who are here tonight. I pay my respects and acknowledge the continuing connection to land and sea, and I pay my respects to elders past and those who are present and those who will be in the future. This is a really lovely place to be. The noise, as we heard Sharon speak about, was really important for many of us who've been locked up in our houses and not had opportunities to come together to think and to share and just have a bit of joy about being together again. So this was a nice timing for that as well. I kind of spent a bit of time thinking through what I might say today. We have some absolutely wonderful women who will talk about the work of the Commission and where we're up to now and perhaps where we'll be in the future. And so I suppose I wanted to kind of, I think in my head, a couple of things. For me, this time is in a sense a 50th anniversary. So I have a 50th and a 20th and a 5th. And so let me talk about the 50th. So sadly, as I was thinking about this, maybe sadly, but there you go, it was about the time I decided to join the New South Wales Police. I know I'm young. I look much younger than that. They didn't take you at 5, trust me. But they did take you at 18 and a half. And so it was kind of that stage. And what struck me when you think about, you know, where we've come from, it's always really wonderful. I mean, you know, as Carolyn talked about the 80,000 years of Aboriginal occupation and custody and custodianship and protection of this land, then it seems to me you always have to put what happens in a context and always respect the past and where things have come from. And I wrote a story a while back when I gave a speech, and it fits in that time for me, about my first real understandings of family violence. For me, I was lucky enough, I did not live in a family where I saw that, and I suppose I grew up in a pretty particular place. When I look back, I see somewhat different things, but at that stage it was important. But I joined the police, and for me it was really an awakening about what happened. There were only 130 women and 8,000 men in the police, and I was clearly about the youngest, and one of the few women and one of the blondes, so that was always a problem. But I remember that I had 3 friends who were wonderful women, and they were police women and were, as I sort of wrote at the time, I became aware that all 3 were being physically and psychologically, and as I came to understand, financially being abused by their partners. All 3 were strong and capable women. They arrested criminals, they protected the public, and they carried guns. And for me, it was a real awakening. And the second awakening I had at that stage is this is not just about family violence, it's about gender violence against women. I remember sitting with 40 women police one day in my in an office, and I'm again one of the younger ones, and we got talking about how many women had been sexually abused, and half of them. Half were prepared to admit it, but I'm sure there were more. And I remember for me, that was kind of like, oh my God, you know, how big is this issue? How much harm is being done to so many people? And the other exposure I had was to young girls who were runaways. And that's one of the things we used to deal with. And the runaways, you know, girls run away from home and with this strange offence called neglected and exposed to moral danger. And it basically meant you were found on the streets. And I remember once sitting down with one of those young women, and I said, why did you run? What is it that if we take you back, you have to go back to? And she told me. You know, he's a 14-year-old who'd been sexually abused by a stepfather for 6 years. And so for me, you know, that was where we came from. Could we do much about it? Not a lot. Were the police interested in it? Not a lot. Did the community want to do much about it? Did they want to know about it? And I remember reading police books on this. And one of the things the police said, written research said the police should stay out of it, that they didn't have a role, that we shouldn't get involved. And I remember things started to change. And the history, you know, shows that the changes of the 60s, when women started to be able to have their voices again raised up. We've raised our voices in many cases, but again they got raised up. And then the 70s started to see the change. And I saw that, obviously my view was in New South Wales, but I saw it happening in other places as people started to listen. And it wasn't just particular groups of people, it was across all of our communities. It was sexual abuse, it was sexual assault, it was child abuse, and it was family violence. I did a study with a man called John Avery in '78, and John was looking at the then inspector, John Avery, and he was looking at the work the police did. And even in those days, in '78, when we just counted kind of simple things, family violence associated incidents the police attended accounted for 60% of the work they did. So we think and we come from that place. And what I've watched over that time, as many of you have in way more depth than I might have, is the changes that started to occur. And we should take credit for many of you for the changes. The fact that one of the things I know about public policy is it changes because people keep focused on it. They keep paying attention to it. They keep kind of maybe getting knocked over, but they come back. And that's the really important piece for us to keep doing, to keep speaking up. And then for me, you progress to a point, New South Wales did improve services for family violence. It did improve, as Victoria did. Sexual assault, the responses. And we did think a lot more that maybe kids weren't abused by strangers. They're actually in the main abused by people they knew. And we've had royal commissions, we've had institutional reviews that have very much justified that piece of thinking. So my second anniversary is 20 years ago. 20 years ago, about now, I was announced as the Victorian Police Chief Commissioner. I had to have been the most surprised person when I popped out of up in Spring Street with Steve Brax and Andre Hermeyer as the new Chief Commissioner of Victoria. First woman appointed to that role in Australia, and there's only been 2 of us so far. And one is doing a fabulous job. The other one is doing a fabulous job in Queensland now. And so 20 years ago for me, coming into Victoria, I'm not a Victorian. I came from New South Wales, that strange place across the border. And I didn't think there was any chance I'd get the job, but I did. But coming to Victoria Police, I also firstly looked at a lot of the figures and came to look at the issue around family violence. And there are people here today who were part of helping Victoria Police respond. And they were outside of our community in the sense of outside Victoria Police, and they were from within Victoria Police. And so started a process of us saying it was not good enough in the way that the police were dealing with family violence. We needed to do better. And so my time, I suppose, for much of my time from beginning to the police and then to my time in joining Victoria Police, says that if you have power, you can use it, you can change things. But what often happens to us is people don't want to talk about power because of all the reasons we know you don't want to talk about power. But Julia Gillard once said, position's fine, but power's what you need access to. And I think that's what I see for many of you in this room, is enormous power. And those online who are listening. And sometimes people try and disempower you. And then we'll try and figure out power back, but to actually own your own power, to be able to make the choices, to be able to say what you say. I watched Grace Tame the other day and I went, wow, what a young woman. How in the earth did we find her to be able to have a voice and to be able to advocate as she has? And others who are doing the same thing. So let me come to 5 years. So Labor is in opposition. It comes in opposition and promises a Royal Commission. And I remember thinking about this Royal Commission because we'd done a lot of work and Labor had supported us back in sort of 2004-5. A lot of people worked with us on the changes across the whole of the sector because it has to be community, it has to be the churches, it has to be institutions, it has to be the schools, all of us. And so things moved and changed and they went. But I think much of the time as to why Labor did this, and the really sad part, is that Luke Batty had to die for that. And Rosie had to figure out that she had more power and more courage than she ever understood. And so she joined, many women are here and many others across this country to help and continue the fight. And she got a time to be able to do that. So the government promised in opposition that they would have a Royal Commission, and they did once they got there, announced it. And they chose 3 people who I think were amazing. Marcia, who we all know and love, Patricia Faulkner, who ran Department of Human Services, but Patricia was a smart political thinker and a smart bureaucrat. And Tony Nicholson, who had a big community sector background. And I was called to give evidence before that Royal Commission, not like sometimes I am, a bit different. I'm not always a fan of Royal Commissions, as you know. But in this case, they were very smart, because not only did they want to talk to thousands of people, they wanted submissions, but they also wanted to pull together a whole set of bureaucrats and political advisors and say, how do we get this done? How do we make sure it doesn't get lost? What would be the tactics? What are the ways we get hold of this process? And so that's what they did. And they reported, as Sharon said, in an amazing way. And the work that they produced is what we'll hear about tonight. I think the important piece is what we saw in Royal Commissions, what I see in our communities and what I see in you, is we've come an enormous distance. We can now talk about it. We can now find our voices, support each other, and be able to make an enormous difference in our communities. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Christine. I'm struck when you're talking about power and the power in this room, how many of us have looked to you for examples of how to lead, but also how to courageously demand action in this space. So it seems to me no coincidence that Victoria had you as the first female Chief Commissioner and that we also had the first Royal Commission into family violence. So much of that is the path that you laid in your role, so thank you so much. I have the really exciting role now of introducing our stellar panellists, and it's a bit of a dream team, I have to be honest. So due to COVID restrictions, we can only have 4 people on the stage at once, so we have split our panel into 2, but I do not want to waste any time, so I'd like to invite the first of our panellists up. If I could please welcome Professor Muriel Bamblett AO, Tanya Farah and Jackie Watt to join me up on the stage. In the interests of time, I'm going to start reading some brief bios while they're coming up because I know you all just want the time to listen to them. Professor Muriel Bamblett AO has a 40-year history of working with and for the Aboriginal community. She is the CEO of the Victorian Aboriginal Childcare Agency, VACA, the largest organisation of its kind in Australia. VACA plays a strong advocacy role for children and for family welfare with all levels of government and mainstream service providers to enhance the safety and wellbeing of Aboriginal children, youth and families. Tanya Farah is the CEO of our 2 merging organisations, the Domestic Violence Resource Centre Victoria and Domestic Violence Victoria. Before taking up this role, she was the Executive Director for Crime Prevention and Countering Violent Extremism in the Department of Justice and Community Safety. Prior to that, she was Executive Director for Multicultural Affairs, Social Cohesion and Equality in the Victorian Department of Premier and Cabinet. Jackie Watt is CEO of No to Violence. Since 2015, Jackie has led NTV through transformational change, doubling the size of the organisation and building credibility as a national voice leading best practice in men's family violence interventions. No to Violence is credited with establishing standards and training for individuals and organisations working to end men's use of family violence. I'm going to come and sit down. So it feels a bit more like a chat. Jackie, I'd really like to begin with you.
Okay.
Because you've been here from the beginning, as has Muriel, in the driving seat of NTV since before the Royal Commission report was handed down. How different is Victoria's family violence system today? Have we seen the full transformation we hoped?
What a great question. And what I would say is when I read that first and realised I was one of the few people who'd been around all that time, I A, felt very old, and B, thought, wow, that shows how much change and shift has gone on in our sector and in all the sectors that connect to family violence. So what I would say is I'm in the joyous position of having great people who can advise me on these sorts of questions and give me briefings, which is fantastic. But I actually stopped one of our councillors today on the way through the kitchen and I said, look, you've been around since before the Royal Commission. What would you say is the difference from the point of view of talking to mine on the phone what's going on. And he said, in 5 words, slowly progressing towards integrated services. And I thought maybe that's the best summation, is that it does take a while to shift a supertanker. There's a lot of movement goes on, there's a lot of energy goes into change, but the actual shifting of the practices, have we focused enough on men? Hopefully you'll come back and ask me another question about that. So what I would say is it's not full, but we're making great strides in terms of integrating how we think about family violence, who's responsible for it, who's responsible for responding to it, and how do we join up all those dots. So we're on our way, Kate.
Thanks, Jackie. Tanya, I'm going to ask you a question that seems simple, but I think it's so complex perhaps. But it's the one that I've been asked a bit over the last couple of weeks as this anniversary approaches. Are women and children safer than they were 5 years ago?
I knew I was going to get the hardest question. And so woke up in a cold sweat this morning thinking about it. I think you're right. It seems like a straightforward question, but I don't think we can give a categorical answer to that right now. I think it's certainly what we want and certainly what the Royal Commission envisaged, but change takes time. I think what I can say, though, and this is really important, is that I think the system as it stands is more extensive, in some ways better equipped to support people. More people know where to go to for support. There's more and better infrastructure in place to respond safely and effectively. But I think there also is so much more that we need to do to make sure that we can determine, one, what it is that people need, but also how are we going to measure that in the long term. And I think one of the things we always have to keep remembering is that we're witnessing world-leading and unprecedented reforms. There is no prototype for this. There is no model we can go to and say, hey, they've done it here, let's put it in. And that's really, really important, because in that sense we can't overstate the importance of the Royal Commission's approach to this. But I think some of the things that we do need to think about is what has happened since, for example. So what has happened since the Royal Commission? So we've got a sharper focus on risk and safety, and we're seeing stronger collaboration between different parts of the system. This is due in part to some of the tools and processes that have come in, the multi-agency risk assessment management framework, things like the central information point, and some of those things are really, really critical. For example, the central information point that I hear from our members who are in the Orange Door is so critical to the support that's provided to survivors of violence, and that it's really important. They're the sorts of reforms that need to stay and be extended so that all parts of the service system can get access to reforms like that, because at the minute they're limited to certain areas. So they're the sorts of things we need to identify what it is that's working, make sure we amplify and put it across the system, and make sure that we've got the maximum impact. I think, the other thing that's really important and really important to talk about is the work to make sure the system is more inclusive and accessible for all survivors. And I think we're not there yet at all. And, how the system interacts, both for people coming into it, but with systems that, like the work Muriel and her colleagues are doing in the Aboriginal space, how did all the system work together to make sure we're making sure people are safe? I've got so much more to say, but I'm kind of conscious of time. Maybe I think, what is it that we do need to do more of? And I think, one of the things I think it is really important to call out, whilst we've tried to do a lot more around children, I don't think we're there yet. I think we need a much stronger focus on children as victim survivors in their own rights, and we need to do much more work around that. And I know Jackie will talk a lot more to perpetrator interventions and the work that we need to do to pivot, so I won't talk about that. And I think one of the other important things is the full effect of the reforms won't be felt till we see the housing reforms come in too, because we know for so long housing and homelessness, they've been critical issues for survivors of family violence. The Big Build is a fantastic initiative, but it will take time, and it also is probably never going to be enough. So how do we make sure that we're doing more to keep survivors safe at home as well? So there's some of the things I think we need to think about. I just am conscious of time, even though I do have paras and things to say, but I might stop there and come back in maybe some of the follow-up questions.
I'll definitely come back to you. Muriel, we know that family violence disproportionately impacts on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. From your vantage, how has the work of the Royal Commission impacted on Aboriginal communities, and has it had the impact you would like it to, say, over the last 5 years?
Firstly, it's not my land, so I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners and obviously Auntie Carolyn and the amazing work she does. But I'd say Yorta Yorta Shasha Rang, Bunurong, Tangarong woman. It's really important to acknowledge land. I think that we've got a lot to us, and I think, you know, having the panel today really struggle with trying to put it into really succinct sentences to tell you all the work that's been done. But if I talk, some of the really big things from our point of view has been that we've been able to as well develop the Jalkjar Safe Our Way, Strong Culture, Strong People, Strong Family, the new strategy. The establishment of the Orange Doors, how significant was that? The implementation of MARAM, the establishment of the Family Violence Information Sharing Scheme, the Family Violence Courts. Just this year, the Minister's Family Violence Reform Committee, a high-level committee to work really on, and this time we hope we get it right, because we were talking about when the Royal Commission came down, Jackie and I were sitting in the room, and the first time they came with big reams of paper about this wide, and there were about, how many pages? Someone said they weighed 8 kilograms. I don't know who weighed them. But the fact that we were trying, and how big the issue was and how much of a struggle it was. But for me, I guess what I wanted to sort of, talk to was the fact that the more we put resources in, particularly in the Aboriginal space, and the more investment, the bigger the issue became and the harder it became, and unwieldy. We were starting to get requests for policy, for practice, for innovation, to start to look at and really to address. And so I'm very proud of the Victorian government. I'm very proud of the work that we've been able to do, because now, and particularly under COVID, we were able to respond. And under COVID, we saw the high rates of Aboriginal women that were coming to our service, higher than ever, and we had our family violence team that were at capacity. Our brokerage funds were being accessed at the highest rates we've ever seen. Requests for refuge and crisis service escalated. Over Christmas, we saw fluctuations high, an increase of 8.5, the biggest increase since family violence. And during COVID restrictions, we saw innovative ways of engaging women, keeping women safe. We had a sector that was prepared and ready. Other states were nowhere near us in how they protected women. And I think one of the things I do want to talk to you about, and I think it's really important to note, and I spoke to Jackie about it before, is the data is really interesting. Now we're seeing patterns. And we're seeing patterns that 85% of the Aboriginal women that present to our service, the violence isn't being perpetrated by Aboriginal men. And so calling it, and one of the questions that we're asking ourselves, and we need to ask, is why is it that Aboriginal women are more likely to experience violence? Is it that Aboriginal women are considered less than? So what's the imaging? What's the story? What is the perception of our Aboriginal women? And so I've really been proud of the work. And we're talking about reform, and reform isn't just happening in the family violence. Remember now, early stages we couldn't get DHHS to come along, but now we see the Orange Door. But what we're seeing is now, and I'm really proud to be involved in DHHS and the work they've been doing around Aboriginal people taking on child protection and taking on guardianship. And what we've seen, everybody knows you do a high five when one child goes home. The reunification rate for the department was 12%. For Aboriginal, it's 28%. Apply that 28% to Aboriginal children in care. How many children would actually be home if Aboriginal people took on guardianship? And so now the big challenge, and I was talking today with Lauren from the police about the fact that we're now going to do investigations. So how do you reckon that'll go, Christine? Pretty good. So we will take on investigations. So what will be our relationship with police? How will we do that? And so we think that we will get much better results. And so VACA and Bendigo Aboriginal Co-op will take on investigations. So you can see that we are starting to move towards, instead of sitting on the fence and blaming everybody else for what's going on in the community, we are really taking on greater control. And I think we've been able to do that because, seriously, of Victoria's commitment to self-determination, to a treaty, and only Carolyn and I are on the Treaty Assembly, so we're working on the treaties, making framework, we're working on the Treaty Authority and the Self-Determination Fund and now the Truth and Justice Commission. And so you can't have these conversations in other states and territories. We're a problem in other states and territories. We're not a part of the solution. And I think Victoria's very grown up. But I just want to highlight, I think, some of the improvements. From my point of view, our women and children have been able to access Aboriginal-led, family-focused therapeutic approaches. How come we weren't able to do that before? Why didn't we focus on the trauma? And we've now been able to understand the impacts of harm caused by family violence, particularly on children and the developing brain. We're now doing prevention. We do camps with kids, work with men, work with women and children. Our families and children have been able to access supports that work with the family as a whole and are trauma-informed and understand family functioning and supports their healing and allows them to access other key services, including housing, and that's a really big issue. We know that family violence is the driver of child protection. 52% of Aboriginal children come into care because of family violence. So we know that the focus on healing and strengthening, the development of a monitoring and evaluation and accountability framework for the 10-year plan, I think is key. Means that we actually will hold government to account and ourselves to account. So it's a really exciting space. As I said, I'm so proud to be a Victorian and to be able to see self-determination realised. And I think a lot of people think that if you give me rights, it somehow takes something away, or if you give us and you empower us, it somehow disempowers others. So I'm, really, really proud to be a part of the family violence. And I preference this. I was to go to the Department of Justice and sit in the room, Christine, with all the great people on the Justice Forum, but I thought this was critical. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it's so nice to hear you reflect on how integrated the response has been and working alongside others to achieve that. And Jackie, I'm so conscious that before the Royal Commissioner, we dealt with men in silos. We did it to the side. We didn't really talk about it too much. And we got our key phrases from the Royal Commission that we're going to keep perpetrators in view and we're going to hold them to account. Do we do that now?
Well, it's interesting. I think, Christine gave us the framing for this conversation by talking about power, and I think what Muriel's describing is about power gradually and slowly shifting to communities to take control, and I think that's similar in the victim-survivor space. But the truth is we will only see a full transformation when we really address who has the power to stop this, and that is the people using violence, and that is mine. And I don't think that we're there yet. There's no doubt there's been huge investment from the Victorian government, and like Muriel and Tanya as well, I'm proud that we're in Victoria and that we've seen the commitment and the drive and the desire to really change this outcome. But we are so not there yet. We see today, we've seen March for Justice in all over Australia last week and in other countries as well. It's not going to happen. This isn't going to change until we actually really focus on the fact that this is a man's issue. And I think actually talking about men rather than just perpetrators is actually really important, because it really it brings it back to our uncles, our brothers, our cousins, our dads, our sons, because everybody can actually be a part of changing this. So when we get the defensive reaction that says, oh, not all men, surely you're not talking about me, I'm not sexually abusive, I'm not physically violent, I'm not, I'm a good man. Well, if you're a good man, back us. Because where are they today? Because I think there's only 2 or 3 men in the room here today, excluding our technicians. Where are they? We need more men in this conversation, or we're just talking among ourselves. So I haven't got all the answers to that, Kate, but I certainly want to ask the question and engage on how we do that going forward. Yeah.
I think asking those questions is so important, and also acknowledging what needs to happen from here. And I think, Muriel, I'd love to go to you next on that. What do we need now for Victorian Aboriginal communities and organisations?
I mean, we've begun a journey, obviously, but I think, as I spoke about before, I mean, I think we've got lots of frameworks coming at us from everywhere at the moment. I mean, under Close the Gap, there's a family violence, obviously family violence for women and children, and so that's going to really challenge us, but we've also got justice in there, and they all intersect. I think people think that you can deal with family violence without dealing with housing, without dealing with justice, without dealing with child protection. And I think, the question about intersection, but I think as far as working on Close the Gap, I've been working on the National Coalition of Peace, and it was really challenging to get child protection and family violence in the room because they viewed the wicked problem. And everybody wants to move towards prosperity, and the Commonwealth really didn't want to have the wicked problems in the room. And so we were able to get them, but now the implementation is where we're at. And there are 4 reform priorities, and that really is about Aboriginal control, monitoring, evaluation, mainstream accountability, and data, and the capacity to make local decisions, informed decisions around data. But as I said, we've also got commitments under treaty, which I think will be great opportunities and something that we're really looking forward to. The Truth and Justice Commission, I think, will challenge Victoria as a nation. I think we've got to learn from what's happened, and I think I'm really concerned about people giving evidence and being supported, and how do we deal, because we're going to hear some of the most horrific stories. And so I've been really, really, keen to look at that. But some of the things that we need to really tackle ourselves is about how do we, address systemic racism, how do we systemic bias, and institutional racism. These are really big things for us in the community, and particularly perceptions about women. If you've got a magistrate that's got the beautiful wife and everything perfect at home, and then they've got an Aboriginal woman before the court system that doesn't meet that stereotype, then they get judged and assessed as different. So I think that from our point of view, I think some of the really big issues are around funding, and I think that we agree definitely with Jackie about funding for behaviour change. We can't expect that we're going to deal with the family without working with men. In some of our regions, I think, and this is obviously to O'Leary, some parts of our system are funded really well, and you fund us to do the whole of casework for child protection and, Orange Door and family violence, but then other regions we're only front of house and we don't do the case management. I think what we want to do is to be able to innovate. I think Aboriginal communities this is our second 10-year strategy. You're only your babies in this space. We've been doing this for now our second iteration. And Jane Sweeney, how long have you been doing it with us? So amazing people. So we've learnt really good things, but that you funded us for innovation. We do men's camps, we've done we do all these programs, and then there are only pilots and we don't get funding ongoing. Victoria's not good at building on innovation. And I think we need to our biggest issue at the moment is our Aboriginal workforce developing. You can't have self-determined. Everybody's got a runaway train on building Aboriginal self-determination into government. You pay more than us, and so we've got to compete with you, and then mainstream want to employ Aboriginal, and then we've got an Aboriginal self-determination strategy. So big issues for us, but I really appreciate the opportunity to put them in the room. I don't know if anybody out there has all the solutions. I had to go with the people at the back of the room. I reckon they're the troublemakers because they always sit at the back of the room. But
troublemakers are listening.
They're
so
listening?
That's good.
No, that's good. Thank you.
Tanya, to finish up this first part of the panel with you, we know that COVID changed so much in our world, and we also know that it had devastating impacts in terms of family violence across the community. Is the roadmap that the Royal Commission set out still relevant, or do we have to change it because of COVID?
It's a good question, actually, and I was kind of reflecting on anniversaries and thinking like 5 years since the Royal Commission and 1 year probably, I think yesterday, that we went down into lockdown. So, so anniversaries everywhere. I think, it's interesting because when the pandemic hit, I think services everywhere, and I know that, Muriel and ACCOs, they all work very hard for their community, but even in our area, people moved very quickly to be able to provide services in different ways to make sure that survivors were safe throughout the pandemic. Of course, there were a whole range of issues that emerged from that about having line of sight and an ability to have line of sight into that. But I think it's very interesting that because what had happened as a result of the Royal Commission, the ability to move quickly probably was really impacted by that, because so much change had happened that allowed, I think, services to pivot quickly. Everyone's had to adapt since, and I dare say that as we emerge out of the pandemic, we'll see hybrid models emerge, etc. But I think that, obviously, and you will know, Kate, you did the study, but it was also an incredible strain on the service sector, being able to provide those services in an ongoing way from their homes, so professional and personal lives merging, and the strain that had on the workforce and what it meant. And I think some of those issues that we're seeing now about perhaps some of those structural deficits in funding models and things for services really emerged through COVID. And, there's some of the things I think we have to address. But I think the other really good thing that came out of COVID too was this increase in family and friends that we saw reporting. So really the idea that family violence is everybody's business, I think, really emerged from the pandemic, because we saw a lot of third-party reports come in, and it makes me wonder if then the next part of the reforms really have to be equipping family and friends in the community more with the ability to respond in safe ways, but also to support people that they know are impacted. And I think what I would say is that the vision and the intent of the Royal Commission doesn't have to change. I think we know that's the right thing to do, a systemic and integrated response to family violence, and we're not there yet, but we know that's where we need to head to, and that's what still needs to maintain whether we're in lockdown or we're not. I think that's exactly the path that we need to keep going. But we shouldn't also be constrained by line acquittals of Royal. We've got to go back to the spirit and the intent. I think this Royal Commission... Oh, and the other thing I'll say too, and I know Tracy will talk a lot more to this in the second panel, really prevention is the key. We need to stop this before it starts. There will be no way to really end this without putting prevention front and centre of some of this work, I think. Yes, we need absolutely first-class response systems, and like Meryl said, all the work that's been happening in the Aboriginal community, there's a lot we can learn. There's a lot that's been happening out in different areas. I think that's really important, and I think the fact that the Royal Commission gave it latitude around how we do that has been really great. I think the Royal Commission, really gave Victorians like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to do something about this, and it's really important we stay the course. We do not deviate. We stay on the path to doing these reforms and seeing them done, and, giving life to these reforms, because to go back is not acceptable, and I think to not achieve what we need to achieve is also not negotiable. Yeah.
I think it's an incredibly powerful way to finish this first panel. I want to thank...
One thing that was different in our data, and I know that the police are coming up next, is that during COVID, most of the referrals for family violence were from police. So it talks about the seriousness and the difference. And I think, family and friends, and then community attitudes, and how many we got from the police.
Yeah, interesting.
Interesting.
No, thank you. And a great way for me to introduce one of our next panellists. Thank you very much to Muriel, Tanya and Jackie. I'd now like to invite our second round of panellists, Assistant Commissioner Lauren Callaway, Ellery Butler and Tracy Gaudry. If you could please. And in the interest of time, I will start the introductions again. Lauren Callaway is Assistant Commissioner of Family Violence Command at Victoria Police. She's a former journalist and published writer who spent 26 years in policing, creating innovative solutions to forensic intelligence, post-sentence management, women's barriers to success and strategic planning in education. She now leads family violence, sexual assault and child abuse responses. Ellery Butler is CEO of Family Safety Victoria. She has 3 decades of experience working in the specialist sector, public services and government to prevent and respond to violence against women and children. Ellery previously worked as CEO of Welsh Women's Aid, the national peak body working to prevent domestic and sexual abuse. Tracy Gaudry is CEO of Respect Victoria. Tracy has held leadership roles in corporate, community and for-purpose organisations for more than 20 years. She's a former professional cyclist and dual Olympian and was board director chair of the Women's Commission of the World Governing Body for the Sport of Cycling, where she advocated and drove global reform in governance, advocacy, grassroots development and gender, economic and cultural diversity. Our next panel. Ellery, you're in the unique position that you were overseas at the time of the Victorian Royal Commission into Family Violence. We like to talk about ourselves as world leading. How significant do you think this program of reform has been?
Thank you. I feel a bit of a fraud sitting here because I'm coming in on the back of it all. Can I first acknowledge also the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting today and pay my respects to elders, past, present, and particularly those in the room, and also others who may be listening in today. I've been CEO at Family Safety Victoria. I joined just over a year ago, well, just under a year ago, actually, just before the borders closed in Australia. And I really wanted to just clarify that from a Family Safety Victoria perspective, our role is to implement some of the key recommendations in the Royal Commission, but we do that in collaboration and in partnership with a range of other organisations, including colleagues that have been on the panel and that are also here by my side. And we also, one of the key roles we play, and there's a lot of my colleagues in the audience listening into this, and it's really their fantastic work that's achieved some of this, is to bring together organisations working with government and survivors and communities to create new ways of responding. And underpinning all of our work is really to make sure that those with lived experience of family violence have a strong voice and input into the design, the delivery and the evaluation. So that said, having come here from, as you said, from working for over 3 decades on this issue in other countries, the reason I came to join Family Safety Victoria and I came to Australia particularly was because I was looking from afar as to what was happening in Victoria. There were, the whole world, I think, was looking as well in relation to the reforms, and the ambition of the reforms was significant, and it still is significant, I have to say. And I think the ambition is really reflected in the simultaneous focus on service reform and system transformation at the same time. It's looking at the whole picture, the whole thing, supported by really unprecedented and significant investment, over $3 billion, I think it is, and comprehensive long-term plans to underpin all of that to achieve that lasting change. So that's one of the things the significant thing that really drew me here, and I think that's really, really impressive. I wanted to highlight, if I may, 4 particular things I think are, well, there's many things that are impressive, but I wanted to focus on 4 very quickly in terms of the innovations, some of which my colleagues on the previous panel mentioned. One of the innovations, I think, is the Orange Door Network. And I say network because it really brings together family violence specialist services, it brings together perpetrator services, it brings together Aboriginal community-controlled services and children's services to provide adults and children with a visible access point and response that meets needs and reduces risk. And I think that's really, really important because we've built on the learning from the early Orange Doors that have been opening over the last couple of years. We've built on evaluations and auditor reports and lessons learned from previous Orange Door networks. And I think it's really important to acknowledge we have really highly skilled and dedicated practitioners with a lot of expertise working in those services. They comprise of predominantly community-based specialist services, practitioners working in that network, supporting survivors, changing perpetrator behaviour, a lot of expertise working in Aboriginal communities, very much informed by self-determination, informed by trauma and healing, understanding, having a strengths-based approach and meeting needs. And not only that, but they also coordinate access to services and support, so access to legal remedies, for example, support groups, housing, counselling, parenting support, behaviour change work. And I think that network is really, really important. It's a developing network, as has been said. It's a vital network in our communities. And one of the principles that underpins all of that is that there should be no wrong door to access help and support for families, for survivors, for young people, for children, and for people who are using violence. And I just wanted to, since May 2018, when the first Orange Door opened, we've had 100,000 people, including 40,000 children and young people, seeking help through that network. And there are now 7 areas across the state that have got Orange Door networks. We're opening a further 7 this year and 3 more the following year. So we will have 17 across the state, so we're on track for that. I think that's a huge achievement by community services and by specialists across the state. It's a journey we're all on. And as I said, we know that survivors want no wrong door when seeking help, just as we know every response is vital, is critical, every response counts. And we need to make sure that if survivors are being believed and respected and supported the first time they disclose abuse, we know this can be life-saving and life-changing. So the second thing I wanted to highlight, which has been touched on, but enshrined in law in Victoria, we've got certain agencies must identify and assess and reduce family violence risk and respond to needs through the Multi-Agency Risk Assessment and Management Framework, the MARAM, as it's called here. In a couple of years, and this is relatively recently, over 23,000 workers in a range of state services have been trained to do that, to do just that, which I think is incredible. I know it's one of the frameworks that have been mentioned. There's a lot of frameworks at the moment, but it's really critical delivery on the ground to make sure that there's that no wrong door is in place. And from April, we are extending that requirement. That requirement extends to a further 370,000 professionals across a range of services. So that means schools, mental health services, housing services, public health, hospitals, refugee and migrant services, state-funded aged care services will all have to play their part in delivering that framework. I think that's really significant. And linked to that, we know that addressing perpetrators' behaviour, which is the source of the violence, as was mentioned by Jackie and colleagues, is really critical if we've got any chance of preventing future harm. So the next development I just wanted to highlight is, which I think is unique, I have to say, in terms of what happens elsewhere in other countries. It's a unique development, is that central information point. Is the CIP, the Central Information Point. That is a system created to support frontline services to give a much more accurate view and an accurate assessment of perpetrators' risks and their patterns of behaviour held across multiple government systems. So they bring that information together. That intelligence informs the immediate frontline response to prevent harm and prevent homicide. Let's be clear, we're preventing homicide as well as part of that. It helps agencies not only risk assess, but disrupt and change patterns of behaviour of serial abusers who for too long have been not held accountable and not been challenged. And I think that's really critical. And the final thing, before I hand over, I'm aware of time, is one of the things I feel really privileged to see develop and be part of. And again, not something I've instigated at all, but I feel really privileged to see how it's developing, is the really groundbreaking work that Muriel mentioned, that's led in Victoria by Aboriginal services and communities. The aim is to embed Aboriginal self-determination and to ensure that central principle informs all of our work. And the Jar Partnership Forum, which is responsible for leading that work, has done fantastic, groundbreaking work within the plan and its action plans. And one of the intention of that work is to make sure that Aboriginal people, families and communities are stronger, safer, thriving, free from family violence, in effect. And I've just been hugely impressed by the leadership shown by the Jar Partnership Forum members, we've got some in here in the room, and Aboriginal community-controlled organisations in holding government to account and in progressing this work. I think that's incredibly, incredibly important. I won't go into some of the next phases of the reforms that's been touched on already. But I think one of the things that's critical for me to ensure is we need, as has been said by the last panel, we need to build on our achievements. We need to make sure that our priorities are really clear. This includes, for me, having a strong focus on sexual violence, greater visibility to children's rights, children and young people's rights, and achieving sustainability of our ACO, our Aboriginal Community Control Services, and our specialist services, which are the very foundations of the effectiveness of the reforms. We can't do it without that sustainability. We have to centre self-determination for Aboriginal families, and we have to really move from the margins to the centre, the experiences of those survivors and groups and communities, Black, migrant, refugee survivors, survivors with disability, LGBTIQ survivors, working class, poor families, all of those who face intersecting and multiple disadvantage and discrimination, who face barriers to accessing support, barriers to safety and justice. If we get it right for those groups of survivors and families in our communities, it should be right for everybody. So that's what we really need to focus on, I think, in the next phase, as well as the multiple other priorities that we've got.
Thank you so much, Ella, and I'm sorry we're pushed for time. We will need to be brief, my panellists. Lauren, we often hear about the negatives of police responses. So I wanted to start by asking you, what do you think has improved in policing of family violence since the Royal Commission?
Well, firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. And Dr. Briggs, you welcomed me to this land, and you also said, come with purpose. So I think sitting as the police rep in the room, I come with the purpose. I come with some humility about things that have happened in the past that aren't good enough. I come with accountability to everyone in the sector, and also a commitment to do better. And when I say do better, I mean I want our police to listen, to hear the whole story that a victim survivor has to say, not just focus on the bits that can be proved in court. I want police to take action, take reports, whether that's a criminal report or an intelligence report, but not send the person away. So not the option of no report and come back when you've got more evidence. And lastly, I suppose it's around empathy and care, to hear the story and the circumstances in what's happened without judging a victim survivor. So I suppose I start with that because I think it's really important to acknowledge that as a police officer. The things that have changed, and to be fair, we're going to hit, well, we have hit 92,000 reports in the last 12 months, and overwhelmingly, they've been done pretty good. Having said that, it only takes one or two cases that can erode a person's faith in the whole system. And I hear those one or two cases regularly, particularly from people who work in the sector, and, you know, it's disheartening. But I also know that the overwhelming majority of police officers want to do their job well, and they do care about family violence, sexual assault and child abuse, and they do want to make a difference in people's lives. The things that we've introduced that have made a difference, we have, probably the two most important things was we have altered our family violence response model, and we've also introduced the Centre for Family Violence at the Academy. Now, in altering the response model, I think probably one of the things people notice most is that we introduced family violence investigation units across the state, staffed by detectives, a specialist response to high-risk cases, and I think by and large they've been a success, and if we could double them tomorrow, that'd be terrific. They're informed by a risk assessment model, what we call our L17, and one of my commitments going forward is that we take a larger step towards alignment with the Marin. I don't know how large that step would be. I'd like it to be something quite radical, actually. But risk assessment informs the police decision making, and then out of that, the third sort of triage to the investigation model is the case prioritisation and resource model, and that determines whether or not the job will stay with the front line. And with 92,000 reports, and many of them low risk, that's a perfectly appropriate response. But higher risk cases will go to a family violence investigation unit. And then of course we have the Family Violence Task Force in my command, which is designed to proactively engage with victim survivors who may be the subject of really nuanced perpetrator behaviour over time that has seen the perpetrator get away with it, basically, and that they proactively reach out. It's based on a Scottish model, and try to build a case with victim survivors to hold perpetrators to account. Another element I think that it's important to acknowledge, because we've mentioned the SIP, is the information sharing principles. Victoria Police is interested in being more transparent, providing more information, not less, and being a really active partner in sharing risk information and improving safety. Probably I'll just finish quickly because I know you want these to be quick answers, but the Centre for Family Violence, I came from the academy. I've only been in this role 6 months. I'm a bit like Larry. I feel like I've done a Bradbury, I've sort of skated in at the end and I get to hold the cup. But before that, I was at the Centre for Family Violence. It is an amazing place. The simulation centre is fantastic. The foundation training for recruits is far superior than anything I ever experienced in my 27 years in the police force. The fact that the training goes all the way up to the superintendent. But the really good thing about that centre is that there are 21 senior sergeant family violence training officers out in the regions, watching what's going on at the front line, doing audits, tailoring local workplace training to areas where they see that a problem might be occurring or a trend that isn't aligned with, I suppose, what the centre wants. So it's got a really good outreach aspect to it. And when I left, we were talking about the pracs that police do, and the sector is going to come out and see this happen at the Centre for Family Violence a couple of times in the next 12 months. But what we're talking about is building into pracs things around ethics and values and decision making. So not just learning about the law and what's the right form to fill in and how to do a risk assessment, but creating multi-dimensional pracs that draw out, I would say, the values and the thinking of a police officer to make sure that we are making the right decisions when we attend the crisis.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I know I'm asking big questions and then expecting quick answers, so it's challenging. But Tracy, we've focused quite a lot on responses. There's been some mentions to preventions. I'm interested to know, do you think the Royal Commission struck the right balance between a focus on prevention and response?
I'm going to respond in 4 sections. Firstly, how did the Royal Commission consider prevention in the context of the 227 recommendations? Secondly, what were they and what do they mean? Thirdly, how are we taking them forward now? And it's 5 years since the Royal Commission, but just over 2 years since the establishment of Respect Victoria. But prevention didn't start with Respect Victoria, and that's really important to put on the table. And fourthly, what's needed going forward? And we talked about not ticking boxes on recommendations. We talked about continuing the reform effort and how does that evolve over time. So the first aspect of when we look at the Royal Commission, it's plain and clear. You can go up on the website of the 227 recommendations. Those that were explicitly prevention were a small number. However, prevention was intersected within many of the recommendations across the Royal Commission. Indeed, the executive summary of the Royal Commission report, the very first listed objectives of the Commission's task was to identify the most effective ways to prevent family violence. Because without prevention, when you consider, you talked about 90-something thousand reports, 96,000? 92,000 reports in the past 12 months, 100,000 presentations to the Orange Door since opening. Without prevention, that's not a pretty number. That's going to continue and exacerbate indefinitely over time. So when you think about that focus of the Royal Commission, the specific recommendations that were very much targeted on prevention, importantly, we've talked about frameworks a lot, yes, there must be a prevention strategy. And so the Free from Violence prevention strategy is the 10-year prevention strategy that sits underneath the whole of family violence strategy. That's now into its 4th year, and we're about to work with the Victorian Government and stakeholders on the next action plan for the prevention strategy. Recommendation 188 was to establish a prevention mechanism to drive prevention across all sectors and settings in all parts of the state. That recommendation resulted in the Prevention of Family Violence Act 2018, which gave rise to Respect Victoria. So Respect Victoria is now 2 years old as a result of the work of the Royal Commission. And the third, the third big key element of the Royal Commission recommendations was the establishment of statewide education. And clearly topical and should be topical is the program that is now Respectful Relations, a Victorian Government initiative. And on a national scale, there's a lot of conversation around what does respect mean amongst young people, and the conversation, and last week as well, and continuing. So prevention has its headline acts, but also embedded throughout the Royal Commission recommendations. Let's think a little bit about what Respect Victoria was established to undertake and to lead, but not to do all the doing, and respect that there is a sector focused on family violence and prevention of family violence. There's research and academia focus on prevention initiatives, and hence we're here today, and we must thank very much the Monash Prevention Centre. An important part of prevention is not ignoring the fact that prevention is a long game. Very, very frustrating. And so that means the dedication and the commitment and the building of capacity in prevention to be sustainable is fundamental, because the ultimate measures of reductions in fatalities, serious injuries, call-outs, emotional, physical, financial, all of the forms of trauma that are brought about by family violence and violence against women, shifting those dials is going to take time, and it's all of the drivers and all of the prevention interventions into shifting the dial. So an important part of prevention has been to understand what research has been undertaking and continues to be undertaken in understanding the types of family violence, the drivers of family violence, what gives rise. We know a lot more about violence against women than we do about other types and forms of family violence. Who is impacted? Which population cohorts, and how do we intersect personal characteristics to higher likelihood of impact? But importantly, who is perpetrating family violence? And what are we doing about that? How do we trial interventions? How do we evaluate the effectiveness? How do we scale those up and we apply them to different sectors and settings and circumstances? And how do we embed that effort over the long time? That's where we are in the journey at this point in time on prevention.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Lauren, you've already mentioned the 92,000 reports. It equates to approximately every 7 minutes a family violence report is attended to. Should we be expecting to see changes in responding rates over time since the Royal Commission? What are we seeing around those patterns?
Look, I often get asked the question. In fact, I was talking with Ellery and Tanya about it, and the chief will say to me, 92,000 reports, Lauren, when does it no longer become a good number or a bad number? Is it going to plateau? How do we know what is the impact? Are we achieving safety outcomes? And I don't know the answer to that question. But I did pull out some data, because I know people love data, and so I'll just give you some stats that I think sort of paint the picture. Between 2016 and 2020, family violence reports increased by 17%, and then from 2019 to 2020, it was up by 9.4%. That 92,000 is on average a 10% increase. It's been going up about 10% every year. Some other stats that probably are worth mentioning is contravening intervention orders. 2016 to 2020, they increased by 33%. I think that's kind of one of the good news stories because for many years, and even when I was a young constable, it would be, if I ring the police, they're not going to do anything. Well, that stat says they're doing something. Now, in the last year, 2019 to 2020, it's increased by 12.7%. And by offence counts on contravention of intervention order offences, it's been up by 37% over the 2016 to 2020, and then up 15%. So more offences and more action. And intervention order contraventions can be committed in high volumes. So, for example, if someone's sending 100 text messages, they may ultimately be charged with 100 separate offences. But it's also our recording practices. There is the offence of persistent contravention of an intervention order. So we might have 3 or 4 charges, and then that's the additional offence. I think one of the good news stats is that our family violence-related homicides are down 30% in the last 12 months. And I'm not sure what the driver is at. Is it a COVID stat? Will we see it? I won't know for another year until we look at it. But potentially I like to think that maybe one of those 92,000 visits by the police van initiated a intervention, and it may not have even been a police intervention, or it may have been something that prompted the person to go and seek support and potentially save their lives. It's really hard to measure things that aren't happening. But in the previous years, 2016 to 2020, those family violence deaths went up 6%, and then 2019 to 2020, it was up 5%. So to have a 30% reduction is a fantastic safety result. Just quickly mention a couple of other things because I get asked a lot about it. Technology facilitated abuse is on the rise. And I think, simply put, it's not a specialised thing anymore. Most people have got a smartphone and they can figure out how to put on a tracking device, spyware. There's also a lot of broadcasting of images, image-based abuse, revenge porn and online abuse. So that is on the increase. The COVID-19 trends, we didn't see an increase, much change to family violence in the first lockdown from April to May, but during the second lockdown, August to October, that's when we started to see family violence rising. We noticed more incidents around children and parents and adolescents, family violence, and more adults and elder abuse. There was a decrease in former intimate partners, so I think the social isolation probably drove that. Mind you, I was listening to the stats that you were saying, Muriel, and I think there is definitely segregation within these big, broad statistics that we need to look at more specifically. And I take on board the fact that police-generated reporting of family violence in the Aboriginal community was up, and that is something we need to do something about. And there was an increasing, Tanya mentioned this, there was an increase in calls by third parties. And I think that's also relevant to other marginalised groups, cold communities, because I think that's potentially that new source of people that we can skill up to provide the right advice and support to someone to encourage them to come forward. I totally understand why people don't want to walk into a police station and tell their story. So we've got to keep creating different pathways for people to get to safety, and it doesn't always have to be through the police watch house counter.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Tracy, we've had nearly 2 years now of Call It Out campaigns from Respect Victoria. Speaking about prevention being the long game, but how important are they in terms of changing the conversation?
Thanks, Kate. And I'm going to contrast some of the stats, and I will read from this just for a moment to make sure that we're entirely accurate on where we stand, and I will focus on bystanders and third parties towards the back end. Whilst Respect Victoria is 2 years old, we've taken on the responsibility on behalf of Victorian Government to build the evidence towards what type of behaviour change message is appropriate for the particular cohorts, whether it be perpetrators, victims, and the sectors and settings that we're focusing on. So those campaigns to date, and they did commence in 2017 under the Office for Women's Responsibility. They focused on prevention of violence against women, both in a familial or intimate partner setting and also in public spaces and places. They focused on elder abuse, and with a particular focus on a very silent form of elder abuse, financial abuse. And they've focused on harassment generally in public places and spaces. We have the chair of the board, Melanie Eagle, here this afternoon. We've just presented to the board a 3-year awareness and behaviour change strategy, which will roll out further campaigns that focus on particular population cohorts, again, not just victims but perpetrator groups, sectors and settings, and the diversity of our community and population in all of those manifestations of behaviour change. So there's a lot of work underway, all informed by research, which is why research must inform any form of intervention. What we have learned so far, and the analysis that we've undertaken from research post-campaign, which covers both lay people in the community who've seen the campaign and who haven't over the past 4 years, does show that Victorians who've seen the campaigns are more likely to understand different forms of family violence beyond physical violence and beyond violence against women. They're more likely to recognise, for example, financial abuse simply by seeing that campaign and understanding that actually is a form of family violence. That's quite profound when we're educating our general public. We know that in July just last year, almost 70% of Victorians who were surveyed from that elder abuse campaign focusing on financial violence recognised that monitoring and limiting someone's spending and control of finances is a serious form of family violence, up from 50% understanding only 3 years prior. So there is already that awareness of forms of family violence and the impact that it's having. We know that Victorians who've taken part in these surveys, whether they've seen the campaigns or not, consistently rank family violence and violence against women as amongst the top 3 social issues affecting all Victorians. So it's front and mind. It's how we build that groundswell of awareness and what we are doing about it. We'll go into the bystander roles in just a moment. We know that Victorians who've seen the campaigns are likely to have better attitudes towards gender equality and all forms of equality, whether they be racism, sexism, ageism, any forms of discrimination. And finally, in terms of how do we impact change, when we look at the public transport campaign, which we're hoping many of the viewers have seen, hasn't been running for the past year for quite clear reasons, the public transport campaign, 60% of Victorians who saw that campaign said that they would call out harassment in a safe way if they saw that type of behaviour. After running the older people financial abuse campaign, almost 2/3 or 67% of Victorians said that they now knew that they had an opportunity and a role and a responsibility to take action. And so that's raising the role of every member of our community to actually not look past family violence.
Thanks so much, Tracy. And you're finishing there on talking about taking action. I'm kind of taken by what Christine said earlier about the Royal Commission really wanting to nut out not only what needed to be done, but how they could ensure it gets done. And they set up some pretty clear recommendations around the governance of the reforms. And Ellery, if we could finish with you, how important do you think it's been to have a dedicated government agency and to have Family Safety Victoria lead the implementation of the reforms?
Well, I'm going to say very important, because that's... I think the structures we've got are evidently thought through in terms of the planning and are really, really important. Family Safety Victoria, we're an administrative office. That means we're a public service body that's distinct from government departments but has a strong reporting relationship to government departments, in our case the Department for Families, Fairness and Housing. So we've got an operational and a strategic focus, and we can provide expertise to all government departments in terms of the areas of work that we cover. So we've got that cross-government and community sector coordinating approach to deliver on the whole system reform. I think that's really, really vital. I won't go into the scope of our work. You can check out our Family Safety Victoria website, which is a good website, lots of great information on there that I won't talk through now because of time. But I think being a distinct public body enables us to focus as well on how services and how systems operate and how we can improve that, as well as what we deliver and ticking off the reform recommendations. I think that's really important. And I've talked already about, for example, applying the learning from the benefits of self-determination, having an integrated approach, a holistic community-led response. That's really important that we apply some of those principles across the reforms that we've got coming up in relation to future priorities. And it's important that we embed across the reforms and our delivery that person-centred, strengths-based response, a rights-based approach to meeting needs wherever a disclosure is made, focusing on adult and children's rights, human rights. And also it means, from our perspective, that we can continue to prioritise constructive challenge from survivors' experience and advocacy across a range of our work. I don't underestimate that this work is really challenging. We're aiming to achieve long-term systems change, service change to transform lives so that people are safe across Victoria, so that we thrive in relationships built on equality and respect, and live free from oppression in all its forms. But I'm sure, we've got a great expertise in our communities. I've learnt that. I'm only starting to get out and about after lockdown, but there's fantastic expertise across our organisations and in our communities. We've achieved so much. We've still got a long way to go, as we know. We're some way through the reforms. It is a long-term plan, and I just wanted to end by saying I think what motivates us in Family Safety Victoria, and I know in our partner organisations, is knowing that this is preventable. Violence against women, male violence against women and children, family violence is not inevitable. It is preventable. It's as a result of the structures that we've got, the institutions that we've got, our culture and the attitudes which perpetuate inequality in our society. And what I think unites us all is our commitment to address the actions that we've got in the priorities, to address the structural inequities that underpin family violence and its impact, and in a sense limit the lives of people we work with in our communities. Family violence is predictable, it's preventable with the necessary public and political will and resources to achieve our goal. We have that in Victoria, which is why I think in Victoria we've got a really good chance of ending family violence for good in our lifetimes, which I think is really, really important. I don't think it's optimism, I think it's realistic that we can achieve this prevention for good in our lifetime, and I think that's why I'm really pleased to be here to join in that struggle.
What a fantastic way to finish our panel. Thank you. Thank you very much to the panellists for sharing their time. I hope everyone's all right to stay with us for a few more minutes. I'm conscious that we have gone over time, but I would like to echo Sharon's acknowledgement from the opening to the current and the former members of the Victim Survivor Advisory Council that are here with us today. You just can't achieve meaningful reform if we don't learn from the expertise of those who have experienced all forms of family violence, who have tried to access the system, who have accessed the system, who have seen family members access or not access the system. There's so much there for us to learn, and I am incredibly grateful today that we have the chair of the Victorian Victim Survivor Council, Jennifer Jackson, to reflect with us on this anniversary. Thank you very much, Jennifer.
I begin today by honouring and acknowledging those victim survivors of family violence that are present here today. Those advocates, those voices of lived experience who take all of their pain and transform it into hope and help for other victims. I want to acknowledge all of those in government, the ministers, the public servants and the sector who have worked so hard to bring about the Royal Commission and its recommendations to this point in time. On behalf of the Victim Survivor Advisory Council, thank you for the good work that has been accomplished. The current council knows that we have been privileged to build on the foundational work of the inaugural council and all of its members, and particularly mention the courage and commitment of VSAC's first chair, Rosie Batty. VSAC is a group of victim survivors who are not only courageous, but competent as voices of lived experience, and every one of them wants to do more. VSAC wants to see the voice of lived experience completely embedded in the reform process. Proximity is a great thing, and we want to be present. We want to be at the thought bubble when you have it. We don't want to wait to be consulted down the line or partway through the process. Invite us into the creation of policies, programs and systems. Make space for us. We have a contribution to make that goes way beyond our story. One of the goals in the council is that we model the kind of behaviours that we want to see in society. Respect is our commitment to each other. We have 15 members from all sorts of life situations. We have varied opinions, but we work together in a respectful way and around a common goal that has captivated us, and that is the prevention of violence against all persons. We do not allow our opinions to polarise us or immobilise us. Every voice is valued and every voice is heard. At the 5-year point, it is the right time to ask the hard questions. And as victim survivors, we feel we have the right to ask those hard questions. We have a very personal stake in progress and in reform. So we do ask today, are victims of family violence safer today? What does the data say about that? You see, when I began advocating, the stats said that on average, 1 woman a week was murdered in Australia as a result of family violence. Today, 10 years later, that number has not changed all that much. Basically, there are still women dying every week from family violence. And how can we not mention the children also? See, as victim survivors, we live in a tension of acknowledging that changes have been made, for which we are grateful, but we are very impatient for more. We know that it is still not enough. It's not enough when women and children cannot leave dangerous situations because there's nowhere for them to go. It's not enough when people from CALD, LGBTIQ, the elderly and Indigenous communities still feel isolated, overlooked or turned away. It's not enough when perpetrators are not being held to account for their actions. It's not enough when the legal system and courts can be weaponised against victims. It's not enough when we look at the anguish on the faces of the parents, the siblings, the children, the grandparents, the friends and workmates of those who are gone. And we hear them say that it gets harder as time goes by. It's not enough when women are still intimidated into silence because it is too dangerous, too destructive to their lives on many accounts for them to speak up. So when we go to work tomorrow, let's ask ourselves the question, is what I do today going to make a difference? Will it change things for victims? Will I, in fact, make the world a safer place for victims of family violence? We can do that. Together, we can make that difference. We can't afford to lose the momentum that's been built. We can't afford to stay at this 5-year spot for too long contemplating what's been done. We can't afford to coast through the next 5 years. A great deal has been done, but perhaps the most important work is still to come. For all of the victim survivors that are here today, all of those advocates who speak out, for all of those who are silent or have been silenced, for all those victims who continue to live in fear, for the one who died this week, the one who will die next week and the next. Let's get this done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I hear a lot of addresses and a lot of speeches. That's one of the very best. The Minister, the Honourable Gabrielle Williams MP, the Minister for the Prevention of Family Violence, the Minister for Women and the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, talk about give a busy woman, was planning on being with us in person today, and unfortunately she could not be here, but she has offered us a closing address which we would like to share with you now. Thank you.
Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands across Victoria and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm so disappointed I can't be there with you this evening, but I'd like to thank Monash University Gender and Family Violence Prevention Centre for marking this really special milestone. 5 years ago, we took a bright light to our darkest secret, our leading law and order issue and the leading contributor to death, disability and illness for women under 45. We committed to change. On the back of the Royal Commission into Family Violence, we committed to the biggest social reform this state had ever seen, and one that was long overdue. We committed to implementing every single one of the Commission's 227 recommendations, and we began the task of building a new family violence system. We knew it wouldn't be easy and we knew it wouldn't be quick, but it had to be done. 5 years on, we've invested more than $3 billion to prevent and respond to family violence in Victoria. That's more than every other jurisdiction in Australia, including the Commonwealth, combined. The Orange Door network is now operating in 7, soon to be 8, regions across our state. The network has assisted more than 130,000 women and children across Victoria and has fundamentally changed the way our system responds to family violence. We've established Respect Victoria to change the attitudes and behaviours that lead to family violence and all forms of violence against women. More than 1,500 Victorian schools are now undertaking nation-leading respectful relationships education, and some 23,000 workers have been trained to recognise, assess and respond to family violence through MARAM and the Family Violence Information Sharing Scheme. We are ensuring a community-led, self-determined response to end family violence against Aboriginal people through the Delta Agreement. And we'll continue to pursue a more inclusive, safe and accountable family violence system that responds to the needs of all Victorians through our Everybody Matters Equity and Inclusion Statement. Perpetrators are being kept in sight with expanded community-based interventions and accommodation programs, informed by a new comprehensive view of risk through the Central Information Point. We'll continue to support victim survivors' wellbeing through the justice system with new specialist family violence courts, as well as improved practice in Australia's first ever Family Violence Police Command. Most importantly, every step of the way, we'll keep the voices of victim survivors central to the design and implementation of the family violence reform. But while a lot has been achieved, we know there's still a lot of work to do. This isn't about simply ticking off Royal Commission recommendations. That alone doesn't build the system that we know we need. This is why our focus for the next 3 years will be on ensuring that we are building a system and not just a sum of disparate parts. We must embed this reform to protect progress and set a strong foundation for scale up into the future. We must increase support for our family violence workforce and help our sector grow. We must increase our focus on primary prevention and early intervention. We will build a stronger evidence base by coordinating and expanding research, data and evaluation activities. And we'll continue to raise the profile, understanding and responses to sexual violence. We have seen over the last month that gender inequality is still deeply entrenched in all aspects of our community with tragic consequences. Women have marched across this country and our message is clear: enough is enough. We must harness this moment. We must keep marching towards progress, towards respect, safety and equality. 5 years on from the Royal Commission, I'd like to say thank you to the thousands of Victorians who worked tirelessly to progress this reform. Every day, your work means we can meaningfully improve the lives of adults, children and young people across our state. To our essential frontline workforce, our researchers, advocates, policymakers, and most importantly, the victim survivors and their families who have shared their lived experiences, thank you. This work isn't easy and it's a long way from finished, but we are committed to the task. Together, we can achieve a Victoria free from violence.
Gabby's a proud Monash alum, and we're very proud of her leadership in this space. Jennifer is right, it's not enough. There is a clear need for this ongoing government focus on family violence. As Christine noted, change occurs because people keep paying attention. Change also occurs because we invest, and then we invest some more. When it comes to family violence, we are actually all proud Victorians for the roadmap and the resolve that the Commission gave us. But most importantly, we are proud Victorians because of the incredible commitment and innovation of the sector and the courage of victim survivors. And that has clearly been on show tonight. So please join with me again in saying a thank you to our panellists. And I simply want to close by paying tribute to my colleagues in the Monash Gender and Family Violence Prevention Centre. They have been absolutely tireless over the past 5 years, and most certainly they work each and every day with great purpose. For those of you in the room, I invite you now to join us for very COVID-safe boxed canapes. For those online, I thank you for attending and I extend our best wishes for the evening. Our formal proceedings are now at a close. Thank you.